With Radio Algeria International, you will not miss a single major political or economic event. Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, is chairing the second meeting with economic operators held under the slogan Algeria 2025, the Year of Economic Success. And the Algerian diplomacy chief will co-chair with his Ethiopian counterpart the fifth session of the Algeria-Ethiopia Joint Commission. Delegates from the United States and Iran agreed to hold more talks next week after concluding indirect nuclear negotiation in Muscat. And the Israeli occupation has pursued its bombardments of the Gaza Strip, damaging the last functioning hospital in Gaza City. And those were the major developments. Now the full news edition. I'm Asia Bakar. Good afternoon. The President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, is chairing the second meeting held with economic operators placed under the slogan Algeria 2025, the Year of Economic Success at the International Conference Center here in Algiers. Upon his arrival at the International Conference Center, the President was welcomed by Prime Minister Nabil Arbaoui and the President of the Algerian Economic Renewal Council, CREA, Mr. Kamel Moula. Here in Algiers, the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lounas Magraman, has received the French ambassador to Algeria to express Algeria's strong protest at the decision taken by the French judicial authorities to investigate and place in custody one of its consular members working in France. Mariam Barshi has the details.
Algeria expressed its strong protest at the decision by the French judicial authorities to investigate and place in provisional detention one of its consular agents working in France. The move is in connection with the opening of an investigation into the alleged kidnapping of Amir Boukhars, known as Amir TZ, in 2024. Algeria said it firmly rejected both the form and the substance of the reasons given by the French anti-terrorist prosecution service for its decision. Algeria points out that the consular member was arrested in the highway and then taken into custody without being notified through diplomatic channels, in blatant breach of the immunities and privileges attached to his duties at the Algerian consulate in Créteil and of the prevailing practice of this area between Algeria and France. It added that the arguments presented by the French Interior Ministry's security services during the hearings were weak and calls for the immediate release of the consular member and demands that the rights attached to his duties under both international conventions and bilateral agreements be scrupulously respected. The Foreign Ministry stressed that this occurred within a very specific context and to sabotage the process of relaunching bilateral relations agreed between the two heads of state during the recent telephone conversation. It added that the latest developments will cause great damage to Algerian-French relations and will not contribute to appeasing the situation, as Algeria does not intend to let the situation go without consequences.
The Minister of State in charge of Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad and African Affairs, Ahmed Attaf, is in Addis Ababa on an official visit to Ethiopia following instruction of the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune. The Algerian diplomacy chief will co-chair with his Ethiopian counterpart, Mr. Gideon Timotheos, the fifth session of the Algerian-Ethiopian Joint Commission. The session, which will conduct a comprehensive assessment of the various areas of bilateral cooperation, will be an opportunity to enrich the legal framework of Algerian-Ethiopian relations and to define new cooperation objectives and activities in priority areas and sectors for both countries. This will be followed by the Algerian diplomacy chief's participation in the 24th extraordinary session of the Executive Council of the African Union in Addis Ababa. The session will be devoted to the completion of elections concerning vacant seats and positions at the level of the AU bodies. The Deputy Speaker of the Council of the Nation, Mr. Mohammed Rida, has received here in Algiers a delegation from the Religious and Ethnic Affairs Commission of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Council. The meeting was an opportunity to discuss religious practice in the two friendly countries, which is carried out in a spirit of respect, freedom, and coexistence. It was also an opportunity to reaffirm the importance given to the historic and strategic relations between Algeria and China, which are being strengthened thanks to the shared political will of the two heads of state. The Algerian official hailed the bilateral relations based on fruitful strategic partnership marked by broad convergence on international issues, notably just causes, first and foremost the Palestinian and Sahrawi issues. And the Chinese official, for his part, hailed the historic relations between China and Algeria built on trust, partnership, and mutual support. The UN Security Council will hold tomorrow a meeting behind closed doors to discuss developments in the situation in Western Sahara and the prospects for the UN-brokered peace process in Africa's last colony. Mariam Barshi again.
The Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for Western Sahara and head of the UN mission for referendum in Western Sahara, MINURSO, Alexander Ivanko, and the personal envoy of the UN Secretary-General, Staffan de Mistura, will brief the meeting. During the briefing, Staffan de Mistura will present a report on the situation and prospects for the peace process in Western Sahara occupied by Morocco since 1975, while Alexander Ivanko will present a report on the development of the situation in the period covered by the mandate of the UN mission. In preparation for the meeting of the UN Council, UN envoy Staffan de Mistura visited the Sahrawi refugee camps last week, focusing on the reality and prospects of the UN-brokered peace process in Africa's last colony, during which the Sahrawi people's commitment to their legitimate rights to self-determination and independence was reaffirmed. During the two-day visit, Staffan de Mistura met with Sahrawi officials, led by the President of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Rahim Ghali, and representatives of the Sahrawi people. He also met with members of Sahrawi civil society who anonymously reiterated the Sahrawi people's commitment to their inalienable right to self-determination and their recovery of freedom and independence.
You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and to the Middle East now. The Israeli occupation has pursued its bombardments on the Gaza Strip, partly damaging the last functioning hospital in Gaza City. The Palestinian Civil Defense said the bombardments of the Al Ahli hospital, called the Baptist Hospital, destroyed a building sheltering notably the emergency services, causing the displacement of patients. It was the second attack to hit the hospital within less than 2 years. Hundreds of people were killed when the hospital was targeted in October 2023. Over 50,900 Palestinians have been killed and thousands of others wounded since the Israeli occupying forces launched its war on Gaza. In this connection, thousands of people took to the streets of Geneva, Switzerland, to express their support for the Palestinian people and denounce the genocide perpetrated by the Israeli occupation in Gaza. A similar protest was also staged in Milan, Italy, to denounce the continued displacement of the Palestinian population and press for the enforcement of a permanent ceasefire in the Palestinian territory. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Hamas movement spoke out in favor of any peace proposal that could allow for a ceasefire and Israeli troop pullout of Gaza. Asked if there were any room for peace, prospect Egyptian political or analyst Ahmed Atta has this to say.
Over the proposals submitted because Netanyahu has no choice during this period. There is a clear division within the Tel Aviv authorities. There is on the one hand what is known as the series of resignation that concerned various departments of the Israeli occupying army. On the other hand, the situation in the Middle East and the international situation do not allow Benjamin Netanyahu to move forward towards implementing the Great Middle East project. There are many reasons, including political and economic ones, and also the world trade war that erupted between the EU on one hand, China and the US on the other hand.
That was the statement of political analyst Ahmed Atta. And to Sudan now, the United Nations Humanitarian and Resident Coordinator in Sudan, Clementine Nekweta Salami, has issued a stark warning about the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan, which is facing a growing risk of famine and a critical shortage of funding for relief efforts. Miriam Borshi.
The United Nations Humanitarian and Resident Coordinator in Sudan, Clementine Nekweta Salami, said that the population was in desperate situation, calling on the international community not to forget the Sudanese men, women and children who are in an extremely difficult situation at this critical time. Mrs. Nekweta Salami said that the humanitarian situation was catastrophic. The conflict has had a particularly devastating impact in Darfur, where the UN coordinator affirmed that the town of El Fasher remains under siege. She said that the civilian population has been under siege for several months, facing daily bombardments, displacement, and a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. She expressed her deep concern at the confirmed famine in the Zamzam camp in the Sudanese state of North Darfur, describing the situation as catastrophic, citing serious shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Despite the absence of a political solution, Mrs. Nekweta Salami stressed that humanitarian action could not wait.
And in Sudan, at least 114 civilians have been killed in attacks by the Rapid Support paramilitary forces on two camps for displaced people over the past 2 days in Al Fasher, the capital of North Darfur State. Now, delegates from the United States and Iran agreed to hold more talks next week after concluding indirect nuclear negotiations in the Omani capital, Muscat. Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs described Saturday's talks as having been conducted in a constructive atmosphere and based on mutual respect. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff headed the U.S. delegation, while the Iranians were led by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. While Trump and his officials had insisted the talks would be direct, and in the same room, Tehran had stressed that negotiations would be indirect. Chinese Trade Minister Wang Wentao has said that the continuous introduction of tariffs by the U.S. will cause great harm to the developing world and may even trigger a humanitarian crisis. The Chinese official said China's decisive countermeasures are to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests and to also uphold fairness and justice in the international community. And back to the country now, Algeria's rich and diverse tourism potential has been highlighted by the British newspaper The Sun, which describes the country as an unexplored pearl on its way to becoming a destination of choice for British tourists. And that's it for today's news bulletin. I invite you now to listen to the international event of the week.
The international event of the week.
In a surprising announcement this week, US President Donald Trump issued a 90-day pause on new tariffs targeting foreign imports. The pause applies to all countries to the exception of China, which faces a 145% tax increase on some of its goods imported to the US. However, the new minimum 10% tariff rate, which came into effect a few days ago, still applies to goods imported from all countries except for some items, including pharmaceutical and microchips. President Trump's decision to raise tariffs sent a shockwave through the global trading system and financial markets, with the world stocks exchanges reaching their lowest records this week. The 90-day pause announced by President Trump came as several prominent economists, including Nobel Prize winner James Hedgeman, criticized his tariff-based approach, saying that the uncertainty surrounding Trump's agenda appeared to be, as he put it, pushing the country into recession. Asked if by posing tariffs on trade, US President Trump is reasonably responding to the concerns raised by experts about the impact this unpredictable trade policy will have on both the US market and the global economy, our California-based political analyst Hamoud Salhi had this to say.
That is a logical explanation. Most likely, President Donald Trump advisors told him that he must reconsider because of the impact that the tariff was having on the U.S. economy. It is clearly the U.S. administration did not seem to have calculated the impact of the tariffs that we've seen on the stock markets, as billions of dollars were lost. As a result of that, the impact as a result led his advisor to tell him that the cost is too high and it will be very difficult to sustain it. They expected that a loss would reach 2.7%, and that in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, that would also decline by 2.6%. The same scenario was show damage in the long term. It is calculated that between 2025 and 2040, the losses in consumption would be averaging 1.2%, and also we've seen a long-term decline in real GDP. So from that perspective, it was very, very important for the president's advisors to ask him to reconsider. But at the same time, the same advisors and some analysts argue that Donald Trump did this as a tactical move, and therefore, except for the very first day when he reconsidered, we saw the market made a historical comeback. After that, we went back to the concerns and the decline in the stock market, a sign that the investors took this move by Donald Trump as tactical, and they were becoming very concerned about what's going to happen after the 90 days pause. Many investors and big supporters of Donald Trump, some of them at least, are considering their economic strategies and looking for ways of how to cut costs and minimize the effects of the economy. So in many ways, it is most likely that the advisors advised Donald Trump to reconsider, but the same others are suggesting that it's a little bit too late, that the damage has already been caused, and that the United States will have difficulty recovering from this latest move.
In a tit-for-tat reaction, China announced this week it raised its import taxes on US goods to 125% in response to the 145% rise in taxes imposed by President Trump on Chinese imports. China's Ministry of Commerce stated that pressure, threats, and blackmail could not constitute the right way to deal with China, which, he said, remained open to a dialogue with the US based on mutual respect and equality. President Trump, who did not rule out the idea of pursuing dialogue to reach a deal with China, argued that his tariff policy was designed to revive the US manufacturing by forcing companies to bring production back to the US while blaming China for dumping practices. Asked if President Trump could afford to wage a trade war with China and force some major companies like Apple and Tesla to relocate, our political analyst Hamoud Salhi had the following.
President Donald Trump has always made the association of trade, what he calls trade deficit, that countries were not treating the U.S. the same way. They were taking advantage of their generosity. He has always maintained that he would take hard policies to bring back the U.S. manufacturing, and that would bring jobs to the United States. This week's decision to exclude big tech firms of the reciprocal tariffs, including the 125% levies imposed on Chinese import, was a sight of relief to the big techs. But according to the White House, and this is again consistent with President Donald Trump's position, that this exception is only to ensure that the big tech companies would have more time to move production to the United States. meaning that the United States president wants to repatriate all companies. Many are seeing this as illogical, incoherent plan, and basically they are saying it would not work for several reasons. There is a fact that the high cost of labor would force American companies to resort to other areas, especially the big tech, to artificial intelligence, and that is a long-term goal, but it also would lead to cutting jobs. Needless to say, they also add that when it comes to manufacturing, it doesn't make sense because it's cheaper for the United States to manufacture goods overseas where labor is cheap. And then it is added that manufacturing only contributes 10% to the U.S. economy, far less what other sectors produce. The service industry, like the financial and legal services, the healthcare, education, just as an example, makes 70% of the U.S. economy and 30% of all its export. So what appears to be a way to get the American public behind President Donald Trump arguing that tariffs will bring manufacturing back is at best difficult to achieve, and at worst it could be a fiction. And from what we've seen so far, it doesn't, according to many observers, it doesn't make sense.
The pause announced by President Trump on reciprocal tariffs previously imposed on about 60 countries, to the exception of China, is seen as an attempt to isolate the Chinese economy. In this respect, the Director General of the World Trade Organization warned against the adverse repercussions on the escalating trade feud on the global economy. She said she feared that a division of the global economy into two blocks could lead to a long-term reduction in global real GDP by nearly 7%. Let's note that China has already called on the European Union to jointly oppose what it termed unilateral bullying practices, in a clear reference to President Trump's sweeping global tariffs. Asked if President Trump's administration is seeking to dismantle all regulations by challenging decades of free trade agreements reached as part of globalization, which the United States has long promoted, our political analyst Hamid Salhi commented the issue.
Only time will tell if President Donald Trump is seeking to dismantle international regulations by challenging free trade agreements that are reached during this globalization, and which the United States has been a leader. President Donald Trump could be that leader who risks all to take America to that next level of economic prosperity. With artificial intelligence evolving at a high speed, a speed that has never seen before, President Trump could be setting in motion a new economy that relies heavily on robots and electronic machines to function. The problem with this proposition, however, is that the timing is not right. President Trump is risking a global recession at a time when the American economy is thriving and American economic alliances, if not the world economic alliances as well, including BRICS, are stable and politically stable as well. What is even more puzzling, as some reported, the tariffs have the potential to dismantle America's superiority and reverse its job and economic growth. All this to suggest that President Trump maybe has the wisdom to see to it that the current regulation do not do well in an era where artificial intelligence would be leading the economy, and thus he's taking a big risk. There is a bit of truth in this proposition and to explain why President Trump appears to put the U.S. at risk. But it seems the most logical explanation is connected to President's personality, which always strive to put himself in the headline and shock people by his decision. But more than anything else, it's connected to President Trump's electoral campaign and how he views the U.S. trade with other nations. President Donald Trump takes the imbalance of trade between the U.S. and its partners, including China, as a theft. A way, according to him, foreign countries take advantage of the United States to steal from the U.S. During his campaign, President Donald Trump pledged to save America and to write it in. And that runs very well with his base. And that's his aim, is to please his base and to appear as if he's fulfilling his pledge towards them. All this happening despite the reality that the United States has the wealthiest economy in the world. And as projected by the IMF, the U.S. will outgrow the rest of the countries. Which way is President Trump heading the United States? It is clearly that his decisions, the tariffs, are not in connection or do not align well with where America is today.
It is worth recalling that recently protesters rallied across the US, notably outside the White House in Washington, to denounce the measures, notably the social and economic ones taken by President Trump. It was the largest nationwide protest staged since President Trump took office in January.